today, and I will do as I was asked, which is to discuss the horrendous conditions in the financial markets, our real economy that all of us are experiencing. But while that is my assigned topic, and that's what I'll do, I do think that it is very important to remember, even though I'm not going to discuss this, that we are also at a critical juncture with respect to the long-term outlook for the U.S. economy. We are at a time of truly historic transformation in the global economy, and that presents enormous opportunities but also enormous challenges. And while I'm not going to discuss that in these remarks, it's perhaps something we can return to later in our conversation. As to the crisis itself, as all of you well know, as all of us too well know, these are the most difficult conditions in U.S. financial markets in 70 years, that is to say, since the Great Depression, although this is certainly not a replica of the Great Depression. It's also an exceedingly difficult time in our real economy. What I'll do in my remarks is to set out my views as to how we got here, the outlook going forward, and also policy response. But let me also, having said that, let me also make the cautionary comment that when the causes of today's crisis are so unprecedented, the conditions themselves are so unprecedented, and the policy response, both as to magnitude and substance, are so unprecedented, it seems to me that any judgments that you make about any of the matters that I'll be discussing, or any judgment anybody else makes about outlook, cause, or policy, has to be subject to a far greater degree of uncertainty than would ordinarily be the case. Let me start with how we got here, and I'm going to spend a fair bit of time on this because I think in order to understand or to think about the outlook and also to think about policy, we have to understand, better understand, how we got where we are. About 3-4 years ago, one of the best known investors in the world, he lives in London, it's a name all of you would recognize, said to me that the only undervalued asset in the world was risk. And that tracked an increasingly widely held view, a view which I held and discussed in my speeches, that risk was becoming increasingly underweighted across almost all asset classes, very much including credit extension. And that at some point, in all likelihood, assuming that was right, that would lead to a cyclical downturn and maybe even a sharp downturn. But what actually occurred was not a cyclical downturn. Instead, we had a combination, at least in my view, of cyclical excesses with a whole host of other powerful forces. And it was that combination that generated the huge consequences and the extreme conditions that we're experiencing today. And let me briefly list those forces, because I do think, as I said a moment ago, that one needs to understand where this came from if one is going to try to make a judgment about the future and also what to do about it. An enormous increase in housing prices that created complacency amongst borrowers and lenders. A very important item, stagnant median real wages for the whole decade that led consumers to over-leverage themselves, substantially over-leverage themselves, in order simply to maintain living standards. Low interest rates that led for a reaching for yield. Global imbalances that helped keep interest rates in this country artificially low. Shoddy and, in some cases, fraudulent mortgage practices. Large increases in financial institution leverage and in holdings of low-quality assets as good conditions continued for a substantial period of time. A massive increase in the use of complex instruments of financial engineering, derivatives, and the like. Mark-to-market accounting that, at least in my view, and I think this is unarguable actually in terms of the effects itself, mark-to-market accounting that created vicious cycle pressures on market prices and then on balance sheets and then fed back and forth. And finally, misguided AAA ratings on certain derivative instruments related to subprime mortgages that were very much at the center of all that happened. At the same time, in addition to all of this, the American consumer began facing increasing headwinds, increasing pressures from tight credit, over-leveraging, increased oil prices, although this went back down later, declining housing prices, a declining stock market, and then subsequently from rising unemployment and increasing anxiety. As time went on, the problems in the financial system, the problems for the consumer, both fed into the real economy. The real economy itself began to weaken, and then all three of these, financial markets, consumption, and the real economy, began to feed each other in negative feedback loops. There were many observers who saw and commented on one or more of these factors, the housing bubble, for example. But what virtually no one in our financial system, people at financial institutions, investors, regulators, analysts, commentators, what virtually no one recognized was that so many factors were coming together at the same time and the powerful consequences that that could have. And when I look back myself at all that's happened, and I've thought enormous amount about this, my own regret is that I, too, failed to recognize that so many forces were coming together and the serious possibility that all of these forces coming together could lead to the kind of extreme circumstances we are currently having. Moving forward, following the failure of Lehman Brothers, September of 2008, the duress in the financial markets went to new levels. All sectors of the real economy, including consumers, businesses, nonprofit organizations, states and cities, and consumers, I mentioned consumers already, and all others, went into a mode of greatly increased cutting back, and the real economy inflected sharply downward. Meanwhile, as conditions in the American financial markets and the American real economy worsened, ever greater difficulties developed around the world, in the industrial countries and in the emerging market countries, in their financial markets and in their real economies. And today, as we all know, conditions in some of those countries are worse than the conditions in the United States. I was in Korea recently. I was invited by the governor of Korea to speak to the one-year anniversary of the new president. And the discussion afterwards, it was clear that there was a broad tendency, I would say, to blame conditions around the globe on developments, what had occurred in the United States. And there's no question that America's difficulties help feed what's happened elsewhere. But I also think there's no question that there were weaknesses in the financial systems and economies around the world, and that all of this came together to create what we have today. For example, as all of you know, many major Western European banks turned out to have leverage and asset quality problems similar to those of the financial institutions in this country, and in some cases even worse. And as another example, just right now, many consumers and businesses in Central Europe are over-leveraged. And not only that, but they're over-leveraged in euros while their domestic currencies are declining. All of that is creating very serious problems for those Central European countries and also for the Western European banks that were the creditors. I think it's fair to say that virtually every major economy around the world today is experiencing serious difficulties. And those difficulties are all feeding each other to create a negative dynamic of great consequence.